Hey everyone, tonight we begin with the slow motion catastrophe that was the fall of the Roman Empire, not the dramatic Hollywood version with barbarians storming the gates, but the grinding, decades-long reality of watching the greatest civilization in human history slowly unravel around you, one broken aqueduct, an unpaid soldier at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this, you're Marcus Aurelius Valerius, a middle-class merchant living in Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, France, in the year 250 CE. Your grandfather used to tell stories about the Golden Age under Trajan, when Roman roads stretched like arteries across 3 continents, and a single coin could buy you safe passage from Hadrian's Wall to the deserts of Syria. Those stories feel like myths now. You wake up this morning in your modest domus, and the first thing you notice is that familiar smell, not bread baking or incense burning, but something more subtle and infinitely more unsettling. It's the smell of decay, not rotting food or sewage, though the city's drainage has been getting worse lately. No, this is the smell of a civilization slowly composting. It's in the mortar crumbling from your walls, the rust eating at the iron fittings on your shutters, the musty odour rising from scrolls that your father could no longer afford to replace with fresh papyrus. Your wife Claudia is already up, arguing with the baker's boy at your front door. The price of bread has doubled again this week. Not because wheat is scarce, the Egyptian grain ships are still arriving, though less frequently than they used to. No, it's because Emperor Decius has been debasing the currency again. Your silver denarii, the ones with his stern face pressed into them, contain barely any silver at all now. They're mostly copper with a thin silver wash that rubs off on your fingers. The baker's boy, he can't be more than 12, shrugs at Claudia's protests, with the weary cynicism of someone who's watched 3 emperors die violent deaths in the past 5 years. My master says if you don't like the price, take it up with the Praetorian Guard, he says. They're the ones who keep killing the emperors. This is your new normal. Political chaos has become so routine that children joke about it. You remember when the death of an emperor was a cosmic event, when the entire city would shut down for weeks of mourning or celebration. Now, last month, when news arrived that Decius had been killed fighting the Goths in some muddy field near the Danube, the most common reaction was exasperated sighs and muttered calculations about how the new emperor, what was his name again, would probably debase the currency even further. You dress in your second best tunic, your best one is being mended again because you can't afford to replace it, and step out into the streets of Lugdunum. The city still bears the bones of imperial grandeur. The Forum is still magnificent, even if half the shops around its perimeter are boarded up. The amphitheatre still hosts games, though they're increasingly grim affairs featuring condemned criminals rather than professional gladiators, because the city can't afford to maintain a proper gladiatorial school anymore. But it's the little things that really tell the story. The public fountains that used to run clear and cold now sputter brown water when they run at all. 3 of the major aqueducts serving the city haven't been properly maintained in years because the engineers keep getting reassigned to emergency military projects. The beautiful mosaic in front of the Temple of Jupiter has a growing hole in one corner where stones have come loose, and no one bothers to fix it because the municipal treasury is empty. You're walking to your shop, you deal in garum, that fermented fish sauce that Romans put on everything, when you pass a group of Germanic auxiliaries lounging outside a tavern. They're supposed to be Roman soldiers, but they look more like what your grandfather would have called barbarians. They wear Roman armor, carry Roman standards, and are paid with Roman silver, but they speak to each other in their tribal tongues and eye Roman citizens with barely concealed contempt. Their centurion is a Roman named Lucius Cassius, and you know him slightly because he sometimes buys garum from you, but even he's changed. 3 years ago he was a proud professional soldier who polished his armor every morning and could recite the entire history of his legion. Now his gear is dented and patched. His eyes have that hollow look of a man who's seen too many friends die for emperors who lasted less than a year, and he started talking about buying land in his hometown and raising chickens. The barbarians aren't at the gates, he told you last month, after a few too many cups of wine. The barbarians are wearing our uniforms and drawing our pay, and half the time they're better Romans than we are. You reach your shop and immediately notice that someone has broken one of your storage amphorae during the night. Not to steal anything, they left a garum, but apparently just for the fun of destruction. This has been happening more often lately. Young Romans with nothing to do and no prospects taking out their frustration on other people's property. The vigilers, the night watch, are spread too thin to investigate petty vandalism, assuming they even care. Your business partner, Gaius, arrives late, as usual, reeking of cheap wine and rubbing his temples. He's been drinking more heavily lately, and you don't blame him. His eldest son was conscripted last year and sent to some godforsaken frontier post along the Rhine. No word from him in 6 months. His younger son has joined one of those new Christian cults that keep springing up around the city like mushrooms after rain. The world is ending, Gaius mutters as he surveys the broken amphora. My grandfather fought in Dacia under Trajan, came back with enough gold to buy 3 houses. My father served in Armenia under Hadrian, came back with stories and scars and a pension that kept him comfortable until he died. My son gets sent to hold a crumbling fort against German tribes who outnumber our garrison 10 to 1. And for what? So some Syrian teenager can wear the purple for 3 months before his own guards stab him. You sweep up the broken pottery and try to salvage the garum, but your mind is elsewhere. You're thinking about your own son, Lucius, who's apprenticed to a blacksmith across town. Smart boy, good with his hands, but increasingly restless. He keeps talking about joining a merchant caravan heading east to Constantinople, where he's heard there are opportunities for young Romans willing to start over. Constantinople, that upstart city that Emperor Constantine built as a new Rome 20 years ago. You've heard it's beautiful, prosperous, protected by massive walls and a powerful navy. Everything that old Rome isn't anymore. The morning drags on. A few customers trickle in, but business is slow. Romans are eating simpler foods these days, and garum is becoming a luxury many can't afford. You're considering closing early, when Claudia arrives with disturbing news from the market. The garrison commander has posted notices requiring all citizens to register for emergency labor service. Something about reinforcing the city walls. Why do we need to reinforce the walls, you ask? Lugdunum is 300 miles from the nearest barbarian tribe. Claudia gives you that look. Wives reserved for husbands who are being deliberately obtuse. Because last month, it was 200 miles, and the month before that, it was 100 miles. The frontier doesn't exist anymore, Marcus. It's just a line on maps in Rome that has nothing to do with where the Germans actually are. She's right, of course. The old system of fixed borders defended by permanent legions is collapsing. Tribes that were peaceful allies 5 years ago are raiding Roman territory today, not because they're inherently hostile, but because the empire can't afford to pay them their subsidies anymore, and they need to eat. So they take what they need from Roman farms and towns, which means those communities can't pay their taxes, which means the empire has even less money to pay subsidies, which means more tribes turn to raiding. It's a death spiral, and everyone knows it, but no one talks about it directly. It's like living in a house that's slowly sinking into a swamp. You adjust to each new crack in the walls, each door that no longer closes properly, each room that floods a little more each year. Because what else can you do? You close the shop early and walk home through streets that feel subtly different than they did this morning. There are more soldiers around than usual, and they look nervous. Groups of citizens cluster around public notice boards, reading official proclamations in worried whispers. Children play in the alleys, but their games have changed. Instead of Romans and barbarians, where the Romans always win, they play emperor, where the goal is to see how long you can stay alive before someone assassinates you. At dinner, your family gathers around a table that feels increasingly empty. Your eldest daughter married a tax collector and moved to Massilia last year. Your middle son is with the legions, probably dead, though you still tell yourself he's just stationed somewhere remote. Only young Lucius remains, and he's growing more distant every day. "Tell me about grandfather again," Lucius says, picking at his simple meal of bread, olives, and watered wine. The stories about when Rome was great. You glance at Claudia, who raises an eyebrow. This has become a dangerous topic in your household, not because the stories themselves are seditious, but because they make the present look so pathetic by comparison. How do you explain to a 17-year-old boy that his great-grandfather lived in an age when Roman citizenship meant something, when Roman roads were safe to travel, when Roman law was respected from Britain to Egypt, when being Roman was the greatest privilege in the world? Your great-grandfather served under Emperor Trajan. You begin carefully. In those days, the legions were. You pause. How do you say professional soldiers who served for 25 years and retired with land grants and pensions without implying that today's legions are desperate conscripts and foreign mercenaries who might mutiny if you look at them wrong? The legions were different then, you settle on. The empire was expanding. There was money for proper equipment, proper training, proper rewards for service. Roads were maintained, aqueducts were built, cities grew. What changed? Lucius asks. That's the question, isn't it? What changed? How do you explain the inexplicable? How do you tell your son that the greatest civilization in human history is dissolving not because of any single catastrophic event, but because of 1,000 small failures compounding over decades? The empire grew too large, you say finally. Too many borders to defend, too many people to govern, too many problems to solve. And then the problems started solving themselves in ways we didn't like. After dinner, you walk through the city as the sun sets. Lugdunum still looks magnificent in the golden light. The temples and basilicas, the broad streets, the impressive public buildings. But you know what to look for now. The weeds growing between the stones, the broken statues that no one bothers to repair, the public buildings that are slowly being cannibalized for building materials because it's cheaper than quarrying new stone. You stop at your favorite tavern, a place where merchants and craftsmen gather to complain about the state of the world over cups of decent wine. Tonight, the conversation is grimmer than usual. Antonius the potter is talking about closing his workshop because he can't afford the clay anymore. Not because clay is scarce, but because the roads between Lugdunum and the clay deposits have become too dangerous to travel regularly. My grandfather supplied pottery to half of Gaul, Antonius says bitterly. My father had contracts with the army, traded as far as the Rhine, and now I'm reduced to selling chamber pots to whatever locals can still afford them. Quintus, the wool merchant, nods grimly. I haven't had a shipment from Britain in 8 months. Used to get 3 caravans a year, regular as clockwork. Now, the Saxon pirates control the channel, and even if you could get wool across, The roads through northern Gaul are crawling with bandits. Not bandits, corrects Flavius, who used to be a minor government official before the municipality ran out of money to pay him. Deserters, Roman deserters, boys who joined the legions for steady pay and regular meals, then watched their units fall apart because some accountant in Rome decided their frontier post wasn't cost-effective anymore. The conversation turns, as it always does these days, to Constantine's new city in the east. Constantinople is becoming a symbol of everything that old Rome isn't anymore. Well defended, properly administered, economically vibrant. Rich Romans are moving there in increasing numbers, taking their wealth and skills with them. My cousin Publius sold his villa here last year. Quintus says, bought a house in Constantinople with the proceeds. Says it's like living in the old Rome he remembered from his youth. Strong walls, clear laws, functioning markets. Says the harbour is full of ships from all over the world. You sip your wine and listen to the familiar litany of decline. It's become a ritual, this nightly cataloguing of everything that's falling apart. But tonight something feels different. Maybe it's the news about the wall reinforcements, or the nervous energy of the soldiers in the streets. But there's an urgency to the conversation that wasn't there before. How long do we have? Asks Marcus Fabius, a silversmith whose business has collapsed because no one can afford luxury goods anymore. I mean, really, how long before this place becomes completely unlivable? The question hangs in the air like smoke from the oil lamps. Everyone knows what he's really asking. Should we run while we still can? Flavius, the former official, drains his cup and sets it down with finality. My grandfather used to say that Rome would last forever because Romans were different from other people. We were disciplined, organized, civilized. We built things that lasted. We created systems that worked. He laughs bitterly. You know what I think made Romans different. We were lucky to be born in the right place at the right time when everything was expanding and there was enough wealth to go around and enough enemies to unite against. Take away the luck, and we're just another collection of squabbling tribes fighting over a shrinking pie. You walk home through streets that feel more dangerous than they did even a month ago. Not because of any specific threat, but because of the absence of the subtle signs of order and prosperity that you've taken for granted your entire life. Fewer oil lamps burning in windows because oil is expensive. Fewer people on the streets because honest citizens hurry home before dark. More buildings standing empty because their owners have fled to safer, more prosperous places. Claudia is waiting up for you, mending clothes by lamplight, with the focused intensity of someone who knows that making things last is no longer optional. I've been thinking about what you said this morning, she says without looking up from her needlework, about Lucius wanting to join a caravan to Constantinople. You sit down heavily. And maybe he should go. She sets down her mending and looks at you directly. What future does he have here? Learn a trade that's becoming obsolete. Join an army that can't pay its soldiers. Watch everything his great-grandfather built slowly crumble. You want to argue. But what's your counter-argument? That Lugdunum is still a fine place to live. That the Roman Empire still offers opportunities for ambitious young men. That things will get better if you just wait long enough. This is our home, you say, finally. No, Claudia replies. This is where we happen to live. Home is where you can build a life, raise children, have reasonable confidence that the world will still make sense when you wake up tomorrow. That place doesn't exist here anymore. Later, lying in bed, listening to the night sounds of a city that no longer sleeps peacefully, you think about the conversation you'll need to have with Lucius tomorrow, about opportunities in Constantinople, about merchant caravans, about the possibility that the life he builds for himself might be in a completely different world than the one you've known. You think about your grandfather's stories of Trajan's Rome, when Roman eagles flew over territories that stretched from Scotland to the Sahara, when Roman law governed hundreds of millions of people, when Roman engineering created wonders that seemed eternal. Those stories feel like mythology now, tales of gods and heroes from a golden age that might never have existed, but they did exist. You've seen the ruins, not ruins then, but functioning monuments to Roman ambition and skill. You've held coins minted under Trajan, solid silver pieces that felt substantial in your palm. Nothing like the debased metal discs that pass for currency today. You've walked on roads built by Trajan's engineers, roads that were already ancient when you were born, but still perfectly functional, still carrying trade and travellers across vast distances. The tragedy isn't that Rome fell quickly in some dramatic cataclysm. The tragedy is that it fell slowly, so slowly that each generation could adapt to a slightly diminished version of what came before, until eventually they were living in something that bore no resemblance to the civilization their great-grandfathers had known, but the change had been so gradual that it felt normal. You think about Lucius growing old in Constantinople, telling his grandchildren stories about the Western Empire that used to exist, the cities that used to prosper, the roads that used to be safe. Will those stories sound as mythological to them as Trajan's golden age sounds to young Romans today? The next morning brings news that crystallizes all your fears into sharp reality. A messenger arrives with official dispatches from Rome, or rather from Mediolanum, since that's where the imperial court spends most of its time now, because it's closer to the threatened frontiers. Emperor Gallus is dead, killed by his own soldiers somewhere in the Balkans. The new emperor is someone named Aemilianus, about whom no one knows anything except that he's probably doomed. But that's not the real news. The real news is in the administrative dispatch that arrives with the death announcement. Due to temporary fiscal constraints, the imperial government is suspending grain subsidies to all cities in Gaul. Military units are being withdrawn from non-essential positions to reinforce the Danubian frontier. Municipal officials will no longer receive imperial salaries and are advised to fund local administration through creative revenue enhancement. In other words, you're on your own now. Lucius finds you staring at the dispatch in your shop, and you don't need to explain what it means. He's 17, not 7. He understands that Rome has just officially abandoned Gaul to manage its own affairs. "I want to leave," he says quietly. "I want to join Gaius Maximus's caravan when it heads east next month." You look at your youngest son, tall, strong, intelligent, ambitious, everything a Roman father could want in an heir, and you realize that keeping him here would be an act of selfishness, not love. This place has no future for young men with ambition. It has no future for anyone with options. "We'll talk to your mother," you say. That evening, your family has the conversation that thousands of Roman families are having across the empire. The conversation about whether to stay and sink with the ship or abandon everything you've known for the uncertain promise of a new life in a new world. Claudia surprises you by having already made up her mind. "I've been saving money," she says, hiding coins, selling jewelry, setting aside anything valuable that's small enough to travel with. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, but she produces a small leather pouch that clinks with the sound of real silver. "There's enough here for all of us to start over, if we're careful." You stare at the pouch. You want to leave too. "I want to live somewhere where the aqueducts work, and the soldiers are loyal, and children can plan for futures that might actually exist," she says. "I want to live somewhere where being Roman still means something." The next month passes in a blur of preparation and painful farewells. You sell your shop for a fraction of what it would have been worth 5 years ago, but you're lucky to find a buyer at all. You liquidate everything that can't be carried: furniture, pottery, the household gods that have watched over your family for generations. Your neighbours understand. Half of them are making similar preparations. The potter Antonius has already left, heading for Massilia, where he hopes to find passage on a ship to Constantinople. The wool merchant Quintus is talking about trying his luck in Spain, where he's heard the Gothic invasions haven't reached yet. Lugdunum is slowly emptying of everyone, with the means and initiative to leave. What remains is an increasingly desperate population of the old, the poor, and the stubbornly optimistic, who still believe that Rome will somehow reverse its fortunes and restore order to the world. On your last night in the city, you take one final walk through the streets where you've spent your entire life. The forum is mostly empty now. The shops shuttered, the public buildings dark. Someone has started a fire in the abandoned bathhouse, probably homeless squatters seeking warmth. The smell of burning wood mingles with the smell of decay that has become the signature scent of declining Rome. You stop at the Temple of Jupiter, where your father brought you as a child to pray for the health of the emperor and the prosperity of the empire. The statue of the god still stands, but someone has stolen most of the bronze fittings from the doors, and weeds are growing between the marble steps. Standing there in the darkness, you try to pinpoint the exact moment when everything went wrong. When did the empire stop expanding and start contracting? When did Roman citizenship stop being a privilege and start being a burden? When did Roman law stop bringing order and start creating chaos? But there was no single moment. It was a process, a long, slow slide from greatness to mediocrity to dysfunction to collapse. Each generation adapting to a slightly worse situation until eventually they were living in a completely different world than their grandparents. But the change had been so gradual that no one had noticed the exact moment when everything changed. You think about Lucius, probably lying awake in his bed, excited about tomorrow's departure, about the adventure ahead, about the chance to build something new in a place where building is still possible. You envy him his youth, his optimism, his freedom to start over. But you also worry about him. What if Constantinople falls too? What if the pattern of decline and collapse follows him east? What if there's nowhere left to run? But those are tomorrow's problems. Tonight, you say goodbye to the only world you've ever known, the world your grandfather helped build, the world you couldn't manage to preserve for your son. Tomorrow you'll become refugees from your own civilization, carrying what remains of Roman culture in your memories and your baggage, hoping to plant it somewhere new before it dies completely. The journey east will take months. You'll travel with other refugees, former citizens of the greatest empire in human history, now reduced to homeless wanderers, looking for a place where they can still be Roman. Some of you will make it to Constantinople, some will die on the road, some will give up and settle in smaller cities along the way. But all of you carry the same burden, the knowledge that you are witnessing the end of the world. Not the literal end. The sun will still rise, people will still be born and die, cities will still exist. But the end of a particular way of organizing human society, a particular vision of what civilization could be, a particular confidence that the future would be better than the past. Your grandson, if you live to have one, will grow up in a world where Rome is just a name from old stories, where the idea of a single government ruling from Britain to Egypt seems as fantastical as tales of flying horses. He'll be a Byzantine, or maybe a Frankish subject, or perhaps the citizen of some city-state that doesn't even exist yet. He'll speak Greek, or Germanic, or some Latin-derived dialect that Romans of your generation wouldn't recognize. And if he's lucky, very lucky, he'll live to see new forms of order and prosperity emerge from the chaos you're fleeing. Different forms, adapted to different circumstances, but functional in their own way. The future won't be Roman, but it might be something equally magnificent, equally confident, equally doomed to eventual decline and transformation. But that's not your story to see. Your story is the long twilight, the gradual dimming, the the slow fade from glory to memory. Your story is living through the end of the world and somehow finding the strength to keep going, to preserve what can be preserved, to pass on what can be passed on, to hope that somewhere, somehow, someone will build something better from the ashes of what you couldn't save. As you walk home for the last time, you whisper a prayer to gods you're no longer sure are listening, for the emperor you're no longer sure exists, for the empire you're no longer sure deserves to survive. But mostly, you pray for your son, for his journey, for his future, for his chance to be part of something new and growing instead of old and dying. Tomorrow, you'll lock the door of your house for the final time and walk away from everything you've ever known. Tonight, you mourn for Rome, for the dream of eternal empire, for the confidence that civilization was permanent and progress was inevitable. Tomorrow, you become part of the Great Migration, the vast movement of peoples that will reshape the world. Tonight, you are still Roman, still a citizen of the greatest empire in human history, even if that empire exists now only in your memory and your hope. The candle burns low as you finally fall asleep, and in your dreams you see Trajan's Rome wall golden, eternal, magnificent, fading slowly into mist as the dawn breaks on a world that no longer believes in forever. You are Gaius Scribonius Curio, and you need money, not want money. Need money the way a drowning man needs air. It's the Ides of Martius in the year 59 BCE, and you've just discovered that your father's death has left you with debts that would make Croesus weep. The funeral alone cost more than most Romans see in a lifetime, but that was nothing compared to what you've now learned about his business dealings. Apparently, dear old Pater had been borrowing against the family's reputation for years, confident that his son would either strike it rich in politics or die gloriously in battle before the bills came due. Congratulations, you're still alive, and the bills are here. You're standing in the atrium of your family's domus on the Palatine Hill, staring at a wax tablet covered in figures that might as well be written in Egyptian hieroglyphs for all the sense they make. Your accountant, a nervous freedman named Apollodorus, keeps clearing his throat and pointing at numbers with a stylus that trembles in his fingers. The situation is challenging, dominus, he says, which is accountant speak, for we are completely and utterly ruined. Your late father borrowed heavily to finance his last campaign for the consulship. When he failed to win the election, the creditors didn't get their expected return on investment. You finish. This is how Roman politics works. You borrow enormous sums to buy votes, throw magnificent games, and bribe the right people. If you win high office, you get posted to a lucrative province where you can steal enough money to pay everyone back and still retire wealthy. If you lose, you're financially destroyed. Your father lost. How much, you ask? Apollodorus winces. Approximately 4 million sestertii. You sit down heavily on the marble bench your grandfather brought back from his victories in Greece. 4 million sestertii. To put that in perspective, a Roman legionnaire earns about 900 sestertii per year. A skilled craftsman might make twice that. You owe the equivalent of what 2,000 soldiers would earn in their entire military careers. Who holds the debt, you ask? Though you already know the answer is going to be complicated. Roman lending isn't like walking into a bank and talking to a friendly clerk. It's a web of personal relationships, political obligations, and social hierarchies that can trap you like a spider's silk. Apollodorus consults another tablet. The largest single creditor is Marcus Licinius Crassus, who holds approximately 40% of the total. Then there's Gaius Julius Caesar for about 20%, various minor creditors for another 20%, and he pauses dramatically. Ptolemy XII of Egypt for the remainder. You laugh, Because the alternative is screaming. Your father borrowed money from the king of Egypt. Somehow this feels like the perfect capstone to a life of spectacular poor judgment. When do the debts come due? Most of them already have. Of course they have. In Roman law, debt is a deeply personal matter. When you borrow money, you're not just borrowing currency, you're placing yourself and your family's honor under obligation to your creditor. Failure to repay isn't just a financial problem, it's a social catastrophe that can destroy your standing in Roman society forever. You dismiss Apollodorus and walk out into the streets of Rome, trying to think. The irony is that you're surrounded by wealth beyond the dreams of most humans who have ever lived. Rome in 59 BCE is the beating heart of an empire that stretches from Spain to Syria, and the plunder of 3 continents flows through these streets. But very little of it flows through banking institutions as we understand them. Roman banking is really just wealthy individuals lending their personal fortunes to other wealthy individuals, usually for political or speculative purposes. Your first stop is the Forum Roman, where the money changers and argentari have their stalls. These are the closest thing Rome has to professional bankers, but they mostly deal in currency exchange and small-scale lending. The sums you're talking about are far beyond their reach. You approach the stall of Lucius Cassius Longinus, an Argentarius you've known since childhood. He takes one look at your face and immediately starts shaking his head. "Don't even ask, Curio," he says. "I've heard about your situation. Half the forum is talking about it." This is another delightful aspect of Roman debt. It's never private. Your financial difficulties are public knowledge, discussed in the same breath as the weather and the latest gladiatorial games. Privacy is a luxury that Romans haven't invented yet. "I'm not asking for a loan," you lie. "I'm asking for advice." Longinus laughs bitterly. "Here's my advice. Find a very tall building and throw yourself off it. It'll be quicker and less painful than what Crassus will do to you if you default." You know he's not entirely joking. Crassus didn't become the richest man in Rome by being forgiving to debtors. He has a well-deserved reputation for collecting what he's owed through methods that range from social ostracism to physical intimidation to outright violence. Roman law gives creditors extraordinary power over debtors, including the right to seize property, sell family members into slavery, and in extreme cases, to literally dismember the debtor's body and divide it among multiple creditors. What about restructuring, you ask? Extended payment terms? Reduced interest? Longinus gives you the look reserved for children who've asked why the sky is blue. This isn't about money anymore, Curio. This is about honor. Your father borrowed against his word as a Roman nobleman. He promised that the family name was good for 4 million sesterti. Now you have to prove that promise wasn't worthless. You leave the forum and walk toward the Campus Martius, where Crassus owns a magnificent villa. You need to face your largest creditor directly, even though every instinct tells you this is like walking into a lion's den, carrying a raw steak. Crassus receives you in his tablinum, surrounded by the spoils of his military campaigns and business ventures. He's in his 60s now, but still possessed of the sharp, predatory intelligence that made him fabulously wealthy. He gestures for you to sit, but remains standing himself, the subtle power play that reminds you exactly who holds the advantage in this conversation. "Young Curio," he says, and his tone is almost fatherly. "I was sorry to hear about your father's passing. A good man, if not always a wise one." You wait for him to continue, because rushing into speech would be a sign of weakness. "I assume you're here to discuss the small matter of the 1,600,000 sesterti your family owes me." Small matter, right. That's more money than most provincial governors steal during their entire terms of office. "I am Marcus Crassus, I'm hoping we can reach some arrangement that honors my father's obligations while recognizing the practical realities of my current situation. Crassus nods thoughtfully, as if this is a perfectly reasonable request, instead of asking one of the richest men in Rome to forgive a debt that could buy a small army. What did you have in mind? Here's where it gets interesting. You can't simply declare bankruptcy and walk away from your debts. Roman law doesn't work that way, but there are alternatives, provided you're willing to sacrifice everything that makes life worth living. I could surrender my property, you begin. The domus, the villa in Campania, the farms in Apulia, valued at perhaps 400,000 sesterti, Crassus interrupts. Assuming I could find buyers in the current market, I could indenture myself to you, work off the debts through service. At what rate of compensation, and for how long? You're not exactly trained for manual labour, and I have enough educated slaves to handle clerical work. This is the fundamental problem with debt in ancient Rome. There's no systematic way to handle insolvency. Modern bankruptcy laws exist because societies eventually realized that destroying debtors completely serves no one's interests. But Romans haven't figured this out yet. They still believe that debt is a moral obligation that transcends practical considerations. I could enter politics, you say finally. Win election to high office, get appointed to a profitable province. Crassus actually smiles at this. With what money? Political campaigns cost fortunes, and you're already bankrupt. Besides, who would support a candidate known to be financially unreliable? He has a point. Roman politics operates on a complex system of mutual back-scratching and reciprocal favours. If you can't pay your current debts, why would anyone trust you with new obligations? There is one possibility, Crassus says, and something in his tone makes your stomach clench. I could arrange for the debt to be transferred. Transferred to whom? That would depend on various factors. Your willingness to be flexible about the terms of service, for instance. You realize he's talking about debt slavery, not literal slavery. You're a Roman citizen, which provides some legal protections, but something close enough to make the distinction academic. You would become his dependent, bound to him by financial obligations that could last the rest of your life. You would live in his house, work for his interests, support his political ambitions, and hope that someday he might consider your service sufficient to cancel the debt. And my family name, my social position, would survive technically, though somewhat diminished by the circumstances. This is where Roman debt gets truly vicious. It's not enough to take your money. It has to take your dignity as well. The shame of financial failure follows Roman debtors like a bad smell, marking them as unreliable, untrustworthy, unworthy of the respect that Roman society reserves for financially independent citizens. You tell Crassus you need time to consider his offer, which is diplomatic language for I need time to explore every other possible option before accepting social suicide. Your next stop is Caesar's house. Gaius Julius Caesar is a different type of creditor entirely, younger, more politically ambitious, more willing to take risks for potential rewards. But he's also more unpredictable, and his friendship comes with its own dangers. Caesar receives you immediately, which is either a good sign or a very bad one. He's recently returned from his praetorship in further Spain, where he apparently made enough money to pay off his own massive debts and still have plenty left over for his current political ambitions. Curio, he exclaims, embracing you like a long-lost brother. I was just thinking about you. More specifically, I was thinking about the 800,000 sesterti your family owes me. At least he's direct about it. I need more time, Caesar, and probably a miracle. Time I can give you. Miracles are more expensive. He pours wine, good wine, you notice, probably worth more per amphora than most Romans earn in a month, and settles into his chair with the casual confidence of a man who's never doubted his own ability to solve any problem through cleverness and audacity. "Tell me about Egypt," he says unexpectedly. "Egypt? Ptolemy XII, the pharaoh. He holds a significant portion of your family's debt, I'm told." You nod warily. This seems like a dangerous change of subject. Interesting man, Ptolemy. Owes his throne to Roman support, but he's always been reluctant to fully embrace Roman friendship. Perhaps he could be convinced to take a more generous view of certain financial obligations in exchange for continued Roman backing for his regime. You begin to see where this is going. Caesar is famous for finding creative solutions to apparently impossible problems. He's also famous for turning other people's crises into opportunities for his own advancement. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that debt is a relationship, not just a number. Relationships can be renegotiated under the right circumstances. He goes on to outline a scheme that's breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. The basic idea is to use your debt crisis as leverage for a larger political arrangement involving Roman support for Ptolemy's regime, in exchange for favourable terms on various financial obligations, not just yours, but several other prominent Romans who've borrowed from the Egyptian treasury. And my role in this? Messenger, negotiator, friendly face of Roman diplomacy. He pauses, also possibly permanent resident of Alexandria, if things go badly. This is the other aspect of Roman debt that modern people don't fully appreciate. It's inherently political. Large loans between prominent citizens are never just financial transactions. They're investments in political relationships, bets on future outcomes, tools for building alliances and destroying enemies. When you borrow money from Caesar, you're not just taking his coins, you're entering into a complex web of mutual obligations that can bind you to his political fortunes for life. You leave Caesar's house with your head spinning and walk aimlessly through the Suburra, Rome's most crowded and chaotic neighborhood. Here, surrounded by the smells of cooking food and unwashed bodies, the sounds of a dozen languages, and the constant bustle of people who have never owned more than they could carry, your debt problems feel both overwhelming and absurdly abstract. What does 4 million sestertii mean to a fishmonger who counts his wealth in copper coins? What does financial honor mean to a tavern keeper who measures success by whether his family eats regularly? You're surrounded by people who live their entire lives without ever borrowing or lending sums larger than the price of a decent meal, and somehow they seem more content than you've ever been. But this is the trap of Roman aristocracy. You can't just walk away from your social position and live like a common citizen. Your birth, your education, your family name all mark you as a member of the elite. And elite status comes with financial obligations that are as inescapable as gravity. You need money to maintain the lifestyle that proves you deserve to have money. It's circular logic, but it's the logic that governs Roman society. You duck into a tavern and order wine, cheap wine, the kind that burns your throat and leaves you with a headache, but it's what you can afford now. The tavern keeper, a grizzled ex-legionnaire named Quintus, recognizes you despite your attempt to blend in with the crowd. "Heard you're having some money troubles," he says, not unkindly. Word travels fast in Rome, especially bad news about prominent families. Some you admit. My advice, run tonight. Get on a ship to somewhere Rome doesn't reach and start over with a new name. I can't do that. Why not? It's a fair question. Why can't you abandon your debts, your family name, your social obligations, and disappear into the anonymous masses of the Mediterranean world? Legally, nothing would stop you. Practically, you could probably make it work. "Because I'm Roman," you say finally, and immediately realize how inadequate that sounds. But Quintus nods as if he understands perfectly. Roman honor gets you every time. He's right. This is the psychological trap that Roman debt creates. It makes financial obligations feel like moral imperatives. Failing to pay your debts isn't just economically inconvenient. It's a betrayal of everything that makes you who you are. It's choosing to be something less than Roman. You finish your wine and walk home through streets that feel subtly different now that you're effectively bankrupt. The same buildings, the same people, the same monuments to Roman greatness, but you're seeing them from the perspective of someone who's fallen outside the system that created them. You're still technically a Roman citizen, but you're no longer a Roman in good standing. The distinction matters more than you ever imagined. Back in your domus, Apollodorus is waiting with more bad news. Word of your financial difficulties has spread, and your remaining creditors are getting nervous. 3 smaller moneylenders have demanded immediate payment, and 2 of your tenant farmers have stopped paying rent, apparently assuming that a bankrupt landlord can't afford to enforce his contracts. There's something else, Dominus, Apollodorus says, reluctantly. A message from Publius Clodius. Clodius, of course, Publius Clodius Pulcher, is one of Rome's most notorious political operators, brilliant, ruthless, and completely without scruples. If he's taking an interest in your situation, it's because he sees an opportunity to exploit it for his own purposes. The message is brief and ominous. Heard about your difficulties. Perhaps we should discuss mutual interests. Tomorrow at the 9th hour. This is how debt slavery really works in Rome. It's not just about owing money to your creditors. It's about becoming vulnerable to anyone clever enough to see how your financial weakness can be turned to their advantage. Clodius doesn't have any legal claim on you, but he specializes in creating situations where desperate people have no choice but to accept his help, regardless of the long-term consequences. That night, you lie awake calculating possibilities. You could accept Crassus's offer and spend the rest of your life as his well-educated servant. You could join Caesar's scheme and risk exile or death in Egyptian politics. You could flee Rome and abandon everything that makes your life meaningful. Or you could meet with Clodius and discover what fresh hell he has in mind. All of these options have one thing in common. They require you to sacrifice your independence, your dignity, or your safety in exchange for a chance to escape immediate financial ruin. This is the true cost of debt in ancient Rome. It's not just about the money. It's about the systematic destruction of your ability to make free choices about your own life. The next morning brings a new complication. Your sister Claudia arrives at dawn, accompanied by her husband Marcus Tullius Cicero. Yes, that Cicero, the famous orator, the defender of the Republic, the man who prides himself on his moral authority and political integrity. He's also your brother-in-law, which makes this conversation infinitely more awkward. We've heard about your situation, Cicero begins, with the sort of careful phrasing that suggests he's already planning how to distance himself from your scandal, if necessary. The whole city has heard about my situation, you reply. Claudia is concerned about the family name, he continues, and frankly, so am I. If you're forced into some dishonorable arrangement with your creditors, he doesn't finish the sentence, but the implication is clear. Your financial failure reflects on everyone connected to you, including Rome's most prominent defender of traditional values. If you end up as Crassus's debt slave or Caesar's political pawn, it will embarrass Cicero by association. What are you suggesting? Claudia speaks for the first time. We could help, not with the full amount. We don't have that kind of money, but enough to buy you time, maybe negotiate better terms with your creditors. It's a generous offer, and it comes from genuine family affection, but it also comes with strings attached. Cicero would expect political support in return. and his political positions are often at odds with the very people who might be able to help you resolve your debt crisis. Taking his money would solve your immediate problem while creating new long-term complications. How much could you manage? Perhaps 200,000 sesterti, Cicero says, enough to satisfy the smaller creditors and demonstrate good faith to the larger ones. 200,000. It's a substantial sum, more money than most Romans will see in their lifetimes. But it's barely 5% of what you owe. Still, it might be enough to change the dynamics of your situation, to buy time for more creative solutions. But accepting Cicero's help would also mean accepting his political guidance. And Cicero represents everything that Caesar and Crassus are working against. He's a defender of the old republic, suspicious of ambitious generals and financial innovators. Taking his money would mark you as part of his faction, which could make your other creditors even less sympathetic to your plight. You thank them for their offer and promise to consider it carefully, which is diplomatic language, for I need to figure out which form of slavery offers the best working conditions. The meeting with Clodius takes place in the gardens of Pompey's theatre complex, a location chosen for its ironic symbolism. Pompey represents military achievement and traditional Roman values, while Clodius represents cunning and political innovation. The contrast couldn't be more deliberate. Clodius arrives late, as always, accompanied by a small retinue of friends and supporters who serve as both audience and muscle. He's younger than you, but he's already made himself one of the most feared political operators in Rome through a combination of brilliant tactics and complete amorality. "Curio," he exclaims, embracing you like an old friend, "you look terrible. Debt will do that to a man." At least he's honest about it. "I assume you have a proposal," you say. "Several, actually. But let's start with the most straightforward one." He settles onto a stone bench and gestures for you to join him. "I need someone with your social connections and family name to help me with a particular project. The compensation would be substantial." "What kind of project?" "Political reform. Specifically, reforms that would benefit certain groups who have been underserved by current policies." This is Clodius speak, for I'm planning to bribe the urban masses with free grain and entertainment while using them as a political weapon against my enemies. It's effective, but it's also dangerous and potentially treasonous. And my role? Public advocate, friendly aristocratic face for popular policies, proof that even noble families support reforms that benefit ordinary citizens. The offer is seductive and terrifying in equal measure. Clodius is promising enough money to solve your debt problems completely, but the price is your political independence and possibly your life. His reforms tend to involve street violence and mob intimidation, and his supporters have a disturbing tendency to end up dead or exiled when their usefulness expires. "Think about it," he says, rising to leave. "But don't think too long. I have other candidates for the position, and your debts aren't getting any smaller." You spend the rest of the day walking through Rome, trying to make sense of your options. The city has never looked more beautiful or more alien. The temples and basilicas, the monuments and public works, the signs of Roman power and prosperity, all of it created by men like your grandfather, who built fortunes through military service and political success. Now you're reduced to choosing between different forms of servitude to creditors who see you as either an asset to be exploited or a problem to be solved. That evening, you receive an unexpected visitor. Gaius Asinius Pollio, a young aristocrat about your own age, arrives unannounced and asks to speak privately. You know him slightly, he's from a good family, but not one of the major political dynasties. "I've heard about your situation," he begins, "and I have a proposition that might interest you." Another proposition. At this point, you're starting to feel like a piece of property being auctioned to the highest bidder. "I'm listening." "I represent a group of young senators who are concerned about the increasing concentration of debt among prominent families. Your situation isn't unique, Curio. Half the aristocracy is leveraged beyond their ability to pay, and the other half owns most of the debt. It's creating an unsustainable power imbalance. This is surprisingly perceptive. One of the long-term problems with Roman society is that debt is becoming a tool for wealthy men like Crassus to control their less wealthy peers. If current trends continue, the Senate will eventually be divided between creditors and debtors, with all real power concentrated among the creditors. What are you proposing? Collective action. A group of indebted senators working together to negotiate more favorable terms with their creditors. Safety in numbers, essentially. It's an intriguing idea, but it also has obvious flaws. Roman society is intensely individualistic, and admitting to financial weakness is deeply shameful. Getting prominent senators to coordinate their debt negotiations would be like herding cats, proud, embarrassed, desperate cats. And if the creditors refuse to negotiate? Pollio smiles grimly. Then we explore other options. Legal reforms, perhaps, or more direct methods of expressing our dissatisfaction. Now he's talking about debt revolt, which is both illegal and historically unsuccessful. Roman law strongly favors creditors, and Roman society strongly disapproves of debtors who try to escape their obligations through political maneuvering. But it's also the only option that doesn't require you to become someone's personal property. You tell Pollio you'll consider his proposal, adding it to your growing collection of terrible choices. As he leaves, you realize that your debt crisis has become a perfect microcosm of the larger political tensions that are tearing the Roman Republic apart. Traditional institutions can't handle the economic realities of empire. Wealthy individuals are accumulating too much power, and desperate people are willing to try increasingly radical solutions to problems that conventional politics can't solve. The next morning, you make your decision. Not because any of your options are particularly appealing, but because choosing nothing is worse than choosing badly. You send messages to all your major creditors, requesting a meeting to discuss restructuring your obligations. It's a long shot. Roman culture doesn't encourage forgiveness of debt, but it's the only approach that doesn't require you to surrender your independence immediately. The meeting takes place in the Forum, in a basilica that your great-grandfather helped build with money earned from his military campaigns. The symbolism is intentional. You're appealing to family honor, to the idea that the debts of a Roman nobleman should be handled with dignity rather than brutality. Crassus attends, of course, along with representatives of your other major creditors. Caesar sends his accountant, but doesn't come personally, which is either a good sign or a calculated insult. The Egyptian representative is a nervous-looking scribe who clearly wishes he were anywhere else. You stand before them and deliver what amounts to a formal confession of financial failure, mixed with an appeal for mercy that you know is probably futile. Honored creditors, you begin. I stand before you today to acknowledge my family's obligations and to request your patience as we work toward a resolution that honors both our debts and our shared commitment to Roman dignity. It's a beautiful speech, carefully crafted to appeal to traditional values while acknowledging practical realities. You talk about your father's service to the state, your family's contributions to Roman society, your own commitment to meeting your obligations through whatever means necessary, and it falls completely flat. Crassus listens politely, then responds with the sort of cold practicality that made him the richest man in Rome. Young Curio, your words are eloquent, but debt is not paid with eloquence. You owe specific amounts to specific people, and those amounts must be repaid, or your assets must be surrendered. Roman dignity, as you call it, requires honoring one's obligations, not making excuses for failing to honor them. The Egyptian representative is more sympathetic, but equally inflexible. His Majesty values his friendship with prominent Roman families, but the treasury of Egypt cannot forgive debts without adequate compensation, and so on. One by one, your creditors make it clear that they expect full payment according to the original terms, with no consideration for your current inability to pay. This is Roman debt in its purest form, the system designed to enforce social hierarchy through financial obligation, with no safety net for those who fall through the cracks. You leave the meeting knowing that you've exhausted your conventional options. Tomorrow you'll have to choose between Crassus's offer of debt slavery, Caesar's political scheme, Clodius's criminal enterprise, or Pollio's desperate conspiracy. None of them offer the kind of life you expected to live when you inherited your father's name and position. That night, you sit in your family's atrium, surrounded by the portraits of your ancestors, men who conquered provinces, built monuments, shaped the destiny of nations, men who never had to choose between financial ruin and personal degradation because they lived in an age when Roman expansion created enough wealth to sustain aristocratic lifestyles without crippling debt. You think about your father, whose political ambitions destroyed the family fortune, and your grandfather, whose military successes created that fortune in the first place. 3 generations from triumph to disaster, all because Roman society never developed sustainable methods for financing aristocratic competition. Tomorrow, you'll make your choice and live with the consequences. Tonight, you mourn for the life you might have lived in a different world, a world where being Roman meant something more than choosing which form of servitude offers the best terms of surrender. The oil lamp flickers and dies, leaving you in darkness that feels appropriate for the end of everything you thought your life would be. You are Thomas Whitmore, and it's 6 o'clock on a frigid February morning in 1887. You're standing on the wooden platform of the Chicago and Northwestern Depot in Council Bluffs, Iowa, clutching a carpet bag in one hand and a first-class ticket to San Francisco in the other. The ticket cost you $47, more than most working men earn in 2 months. But you figure if you're going to spend the next 5 days trapped in a rolling box crossing 2,000 miles of wilderness, you might as well do it in relative comfort. The locomotive squats at the head of the platform like some great iron beast, belching steam and coal smoke into the grey dawn air. It's a magnificent machine, all polished brass and gleaming steel, but there's something fundamentally alien about it that makes your stomach clench with nervous anticipation. You've taken shorter train trips before, me's Chicago to St. Louis, that sort of thing. But this is different. This is the Transcontinental Railroad, the iron spine that binds the continent together, and you're about to trust your life to it for the better part of a week. The platform is chaos barely contained by social convention. Passengers mill about in their travelling clothes, the men in their second-best suits and practical overcoats, the women wrapped in heavy cloaks with their skirts carefully pinned up to avoid the mud and coal dust. Everyone carries their belongings in carpet bags or small trunks, because the railroad companies have strict limits on luggage size and weight. Larger items go in the baggage car, assuming you trust the railroad employees not to steal them or accidentally send them to Portland instead of San Francisco. You watch a family of German immigrants struggle with their possessions, 3 adults, 4 children, and what looks like everything they own, packed into a collection of battered suitcases and cloth bundles. They're traveling in emigrant class, which means they'll spend the next 5 days sitting on hard wooden benches in unheated cars, sharing space with whoever else could scrape together the $12 fare. The children are excited, chattering in German and pointing at the locomotive, but the adults look grim and determined in the way of people who've burned their bridges and have no choice but to keep moving forward. The conductor, a weathered man, in a dark blue uniform with brass buttons, walks the length of the platform, calling out destinations in a voice trained to carry over the noise of steam and crowds. All aboard for Omaha, North Platte, Cheyenne, Laramie, Rawlins, Green River, Ogden, Reno, and San Francisco. Passengers with tickets for the California Express, board now. You join the line of first-class passengers filing toward the front of the train. The cars are arranged in strict hierarchy: locomotive, tender, baggage car, mail car, emigrant cars, second-class coaches, first-class coaches, and finally the Pullman sleeper cars for those wealthy enough to afford them. It's a social order on wheels, with your place in the hierarchy determined by how much you paid for your ticket. The first-class coach is a revelation of Victorian luxury crammed into a space barely 8 feet wide. Red plush seats arranged in pairs face each other across polished wooden tables with ornate brass fixtures and etched glass windows that filter the morning light into prismatic rainbows. The air smells of coal smoke, tobacco, leather, and the peculiar mixture of cleaning chemicals and human occupation that characterizes all public conveyances of the era. You find your assigned seat, number 14, window side, and settle in next to a portly gentleman in an expensive suit who introduces himself as Cornelius Morrison, a mining engineer from Pennsylvania headed to inspect some silver claims in Nevada. Across from you sits Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, a widow from Boston, traveling to visit her daughter in Sacramento, and her teenage son Harold, who stares out the window with the barely contained excitement of youth confronting adventure. The seat is surprisingly comfortable, upholstered in crimson velvet with antimacassars to protect the fabric from hair oil. There's a fold-down writing desk, a small reading lamp, and even a spittoon discreetly positioned beside each seat. Because spitting tobacco juice is considered both socially acceptable and medically advisable in 1887. The windows are large and clean, offering an excellent view of the Iowa landscape that will soon give way to Nebraska prairie, Rocky Mountain peaks, Nevada desert, and California valleys. But comfort is relative when you're dealing with 19th century technology. The car is heated by a coal stove at one end, which means the temperature varies dramatically depending on where you're sitting and whether the porter remembers to tend the fire. The suspension system consists of primitive leaf springs that do little to cushion the constant jolting and swaying as the train wheels hit every joint in the rails. And the noise, dear God, the noise, the locomotive's whistle, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails, the grinding of brakes, the hiss of steam, the rattle of loose fittings, all combining into a mechanical symphony that will be your constant companion for the next 5 days. The train lurches into motion with a series of jarring bumps. As each car's couplings engage, Mrs. Blackwood grips her armrest and closes her eyes, while young Harold presses his face to the window to watch the depot slide past. Morrison pulls out a silver flask and offers it around for medicinal purposes, he says with a wink, and you gratefully accept a sip of what turns out to be excellent Kentucky bourbon. As Council Bluffs falls away behind you, replaced by rolling farmland dotted with wooden farmhouses and red barns, you begin to appreciate both the marvel and the ordeal you've committed yourself to. The Transcontinental Railroad is barely 18 years old, one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history, a triumph of American ambition and immigrant labor that connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts for the first time. But it's also a rough, dangerous, uncomfortable way to travel, built by men who prioritize speed and economy over passenger comfort. The track quality varies dramatically, depending on which railroad company laid it, and when some sections are smooth and well maintained, allowing the train to rock along at a comfortable 30 miles per hour. Others feel like riding in a paint shaker, with rails so poorly aligned that the cars pitch and yaw like ships in a storm. You quickly learn to keep one hand on your water glass at all times, because the sudden jolts can send drinks flying across the aisle. Your first meal is served in the dining car, a marvel of compact efficiency, where white-jacketed waiters serve surprisingly good food from a kitchen barely larger than a ship's galley. The menu is ambitious: roast beef, fried chicken, fresh vegetables, decent wine, but everything has to be prepared while the train is in motion, which leads to some interesting challenges. The soup course becomes an exercise in physics as you try to get the spoon to your mouth while the train sways around curves, and cutting meat requires timing your knife strokes to match the rhythm of the rails. The other passengers in first class are a fascinating cross-section of American prosperity in the Gilded Age. There's a cattle baron from Texas traveling to negotiate shipping contracts in California, a theatre company manager scouting venues for a touring production, a young Yale graduate headed to take up a position with a San Francisco law firm, and a mysterious woman in expensive black silk who speaks with a slight European accent and keeps to herself. Conversation flows easily as the miles roll past, lubricated by alcohol and the peculiar intimacy that develops among strangers sharing a confined space. Morrison regales the car with stories from his mining days in Colorado cave-ins, claim jumpers, boom towns that appeared overnight and vanished just as quickly. Mrs. Blackwood shares her concerns about her daughter's marriage to a California rancher she's never met. Young Harold peppers everyone with questions about the West, clearly hoping for tales of Indians and gunfighters and gold strikes. But it's the landscape outside that really captures your imagination. Iowa gives way to Nebraska, and suddenly you're crossing the Great Plains, an ocean of grass, stretching to the horizon under a sky so vast, it makes you feel like an insect. The train stops every hour or so at small depot towns that exist solely to service the railroad, collections of wooden buildings clustered around water towers and coal bins, populated by railroad workers, shopkeepers, and hopeful farmers trying to scratch a living from the prairie soil. At Grand Island, Nebraska, you step off the train during a 20-minute stop to stretch your legs, and immediately understand why the Plains Indians fought so desperately to keep the railroad out of their territory. The wind cuts across the prairie like a knife, carrying the smell of grass and distance and infinite space. The sky is so big and empty that it makes you dizzy, and the silence, broken only by the wind and the distant whistle of your train, is more profound than anything you've experienced in your city-bred life. Back on the train, the afternoon brings new challenges. The coal stove makes the air thick and dry, and the constant motion begins to affect passengers differently. Some seem to thrive on the rhythm of the rails, dozing comfortably or reading with apparent ease. Others, like Mrs. Blackwood, grow increasingly pale and queasy as the day wears on. The primitive bathroom facilities, essentially an outhouse mounted on wheels, with a hole that opens directly onto the tracks below, become a source of considerable anxiety for the more delicate passengers. As evening approaches, the porter begins converting the car for night travel. The facing seats fold down to create makeshift beds, while overhead berths drop down from the ceiling. Privacy is maintained by heavy curtains that can be drawn around each sleeping area, but the arrangement is intimate in a way that would have been scandalous in any other social context. You find yourself sharing breathing space with strangers, listening to their snores and coughs, and whispered conversations through thin fabric barriers. Sleep comes in fragments between the constant noise and motion. Every time you begin to drift off, the train hits a rough section of track or takes a sharp curve, jerking you back to consciousness. The whistle blows at every crossing mile, and there are many crossings as you pass through farming country, shrieking through the night like the cry of some mechanical banshee. Other trains pass in the opposite direction, with thunderous roars that shake your car and rattle the windows. Dawn finds you somewhere in central Nebraska, stiff and gritty-eyed, watching an endless procession of wheat fields roll past the windows. The dining car serves a hearty breakfast: eggs, bacon, flapjacks, coffee strong enough to dissolve horseshoe nails. But your appetite is diminished by a night of poor sleep and constant motion. The second day brings new scenery and new discomforts. The train climbs gradually toward the Rocky Mountains, and the prairie gives way to rolling hills covered in sagebrush and populated by antelope that bound away from the train in graceful leaps. The air grows thinner and drier, making your throat scratchy and your skin tight. Morrison produces a bottle of hair tonic that he swears prevents altitude sickness, though you suspect it's mainly alcohol and wishful thinking. At North Platte, Nebraska, the train takes on water and coal, while passengers stretch their legs and purchase supplies from platform vendors. Indian women sell beadwork and moccasins to tourists, eager for authentic Western souvenirs, while local entrepreneurs hawk everything from patent medicines to photographic portraits. The Depot restaurant offers prairie oysters and buffalo steaks that taste suspiciously like beef, but the novelty makes up for any culinary shortcomings. Young Harold Blackwood has struck up a friendship with the conductor, who regales him with stories of train robberies, Indian attacks, and natural disasters. Most of these tales are exaggerated for dramatic effect, but they contain enough truth to be genuinely unsettling. The Transcontinental Railroad crosses some of the most remote and dangerous territory on the continent, and help is often hundreds of miles away when things go wrong. "See those telegraph wires?" the conductor says, pointing to the lines that run parallel to the tracks. "That's our lifeline. If we break down or run into trouble, we can wire ahead for help. But if the wires are down, snow, wind, Indians, plain old bad luck, we're on our own until we reach the next depot." This becomes more relevant as you enter Wyoming territory, and the landscape grows increasingly dramatic and forbidding. The train climbs through the Laramie Mountains, clinging to grades that seem impossibly steep, while snow-capped peaks tower above pine forests that stretch beyond the horizon. The engineering required to push a railroad through this terrain is staggering. Cuts blasted through solid rock, bridges spanning impossible gorges, grades calculated to the inch to allow heavy trains to climb without losing traction. At Sherman Summit, the highest point on the entire transcontinental line, at over 8,000 feet above sea level, the train stops to take on water, and passengers tumble out to experience the thin mountain air and spectacular views. The world spreads out below you like a relief map, with the railroad tracks snaking down the mountainside like a silver ribbon. It's beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a reminder of how small and vulnerable you are in this vast landscape. The descent into Wyoming brings new challenges. The train must navigate a series of switchbacks and steep grades that test both the locomotive's braking power and the passenger's nerves. You can hear the wheels squealing against the rails as the engineer applies the brakes, and feel the cars swaying dangerously as they round sharp curves cut into cliff faces. Mrs. Blackwood has given up any pretense of composure and sits white-knuckled in her seat, while Harold presses his face to the window with the fascination of youth confronting mortality. The third day finds you crossing the high desert of Wyoming and Utah territory, a landscape so alien it might as well be on another planet. Endless expanses of sagebrush and alkali dust stretch to distant mountains that seem to float like mirages in the heat haze. The air is so dry it makes your nose bleed, and the sun is so intense it burns your skin even through the train windows. Water becomes precious. The railroad provides it at every stop, but it's often alkaline or muddy, and sometimes warm enough to brew tea. At Green River, Wyoming, The train stops for 30 minutes, while the locomotive takes on water from the river. The depot is little more than a collection of wooden shacks surrounded by desert, but it's a crucial oasis in hundreds of miles of wasteland. You purchase a bottle of sarsaparilla from a vendor and marvel at the isolation. The nearest civilization of any size is hundreds of miles in any direction. Yet here's a fully functioning railroad station with telegraph connections to the outside world. The Mormon settlements of Utah Territory provide a fascinating glimpse into a different kind of American society. Salt Lake City, when you finally reach it on the evening of the third day, is a revelation, a planned city with wide streets, irrigation ditches, and solid brick buildings that speak of permanence and prosperity in the middle of the desert. The Mormon passengers who board here are different from the usual mix of businessmen and tourists. More serious, more purposeful, with the quiet confidence of people building something they believe will last forever. But it's the desert crossing of Nevada that really tests your endurance. Mile after mile of absolutely nothing. No trees, no grass, no water, no signs of human habitation, except the railroad itself. The heat during the day is crushing, even in February, and the cold at night cuts through your clothing like ice water. The train stops every few hours at tiny depot towns, with names like Elko and Winnemucca, collections of wooden buildings baking in the sun, populated by railroad workers, and a few hardy souls trying to extract a living from mining or ranching in impossible conditions. The other passengers have settled into a routine of resigned endurance. Morrison has developed a persistent cough from the dry air and coal smoke. Mrs. Blackwood spends most of her time with her eyes closed, though whether she's sleeping or just trying to block out the reality of her situation is unclear. Harold has grown quieter, his initial excitement worn down by days of confinement and discomfort. Conversation has become more intimate as the shared ordeal breaks down social barriers. You learn that Morrison is traveling west, not just for business, but to escape debts and a failed marriage in Pennsylvania. Mrs. Blackwood confides that she's never seen her daughter's husband and is terrified that she's making a terrible mistake moving to California. Even the mysterious woman in black silk reveals that she's a French actress fleeing a scandal in New York and hoping to start over in San Francisco. The fourth day brings the Sierra Nevada mountains and some of the most spectacular and terrifying scenery on the entire route. The train climbs through forests of giant pine trees toward Donner Pass, following a route that required some of the most difficult railroad engineering ever attempted. Chinese workers died by the hundreds blasting roadbeds out of solid granite cliffs, and their sacrifice is visible in every mile of track carved into seemingly impossible terrain. The pass itself is a nightmare of narrow ledges and steep grades, with the train creeping along at walking speed while passengers peer down into gorges that seem to drop all the way to the center of the earth. Snow still covers the higher elevations, even in February, and you pass several snow sheds, wooden tunnels built over the tracks to protect them from avalanches. The engineering is brilliant, but it's also a constant reminder of how hostile this environment is to human ambition. Every winter, they lose trains to avalanches. The conductor tells Harold, who's been pestering him for stories. Snow comes down like a wall, takes out a whole mountainside. We've got crews that do nothing but dig out the tracks when the weather gets bad. The descent into California brings a gradual transformation from mountain wilderness to civilized landscape. Pine forests give way to oak-covered hills, which in turn give way to the fertile valleys of central California. Suddenly there are farms again, and towns, and signs of the prosperity that makes California the promised land for so many Americans seeking new opportunities. Sacramento, when you finally reach it on the evening of the fourth day, feels like returning to civilization after a journey through purgatory. The depot is large and well appointed, with restaurants and hotels and all the amenities of a proper city. Mrs. Blackwood's daughter meets her at the platform, the sturdy young woman with her mother's eyes and a warm smile that immediately puts everyone at ease. Even Harold seems sorry to see them go, having formed the kind of intense but temporary friendships that develop among fellow survivors of shared ordeals. The final leg to San Francisco is almost anticlimactic. After the drama of the mountain crossing, the train rolls through the California Central Valley, past orchards and vineyards, and prosperous farming communities that seem almost European in their orderly productivity. The weather is warm and pleasant, the landscape is green and welcoming, and for the first time in 5 days, travel feels like pleasure rather than endurance. But even now, comfort is relative. 5 days of poor sleep, bad air, and constant motion have left you feeling like you've been tumbled in a clothes washer. Your clothes are wrinkled and coal-stained, your skin is dry and grimy, and your entire body aches from sleeping in awkward positions on hard surfaces. The elegant first-class accommodations that seemed so luxurious in Council Bluffs now feel cramped and shabby. San Francisco, when you finally reach it on the morning of the 5th day, is a revelation. The city spreads across its famous hills like an amphitheatre overlooking the bay, with the Pacific Ocean stretching beyond to infinity. The depot is magnificent, a temple to the railroad age, with soaring ceilings and marble floors, and the city beyond promises all the sophistication and opportunity that drew you west in the first place. But as you gather your carpet bag and prepare to disembark, you're struck by the magnitude of what you've accomplished. In 5 days, you've crossed an entire continent, traveling 2,000 miles through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. You've experienced landscapes that few humans had ever seen before. The railroad made them accessible, and you've shared that experience with a random collection of strangers who became, briefly, your closest companions. Morrison shakes your hand and promises to look you up if he's ever in San Francisco. The mysterious French actress nods politely and disappears into the crowd, her story remaining forever unfinished. Young Harold, now traveling alone to rejoin his mother, seems suddenly older and more serious, marked by his journey in ways that will probably influence the rest of his life. As you step onto the platform and breathe the salt air of the Pacific coast, you realize that you've participated in one of the defining experiences of 19th century America. The Transcontinental Railroad isn't just a means of transportation, it's a symbol of national unity, technological progress, and the restless American conviction that distance and difficulty are just obstacles to be overcome through determination and engineering. But it's also a reminder of the costs of progress. The landscape you've crossed is littered with the graves of workers who died building the railroad, the bones of buffalo herds slaughtered to feed construction crews, the remnants of Indian tribes displaced by the advancing rails. The comfort and convenience of your first-class ticket was made possible by tremendous sacrifice and suffering, most of it borne by people whose names will never be remembered. Still, as you walk out of the depot into the bustle and promise of San Francisco, you can't help feeling that you've been part of something larger than yourself. The Transcontinental Railroad is more than just an impressive piece of engineering. It's a statement of faith in the future, a bet that the benefits of connection and progress outweigh the costs of disruption and change. Whether that bet will prove correct remains to be seen, but for now, you're grateful to have arrived safely at your destination, ready to begin whatever new chapter of your life awaits in this city by the sea. The whistle of your train sounds one last time as it prepares to return east, and you realize that dozens of new passengers are already boarding for the reverse journey. 5 days back across the continent, back through the mountains and deserts and prairies, back to whatever lives they're leaving behind in the east. The great machine of American mobility grinds on, carrying dreamers and fugitives and entrepreneurs and families across the vast distances that both divide and define the nation. You shoulder your carpet bag and walk into your new life, carrying with you the memory of rails singing beneath iron wheels, of landscapes that stretched beyond imagination, of strangers who became friends in the crucible of shared journey. The transcontinental railroad has delivered you safely to your destination, but more than that, it has shown you something fundamental about what it means to be American in the age of steam and steel and relentless westward motion. You are Master William Hartwell, and your fingers are bleeding again. Not unusual, really. Occupational hazard of working with the finest silks, velvets and cloth of gold that London's most demanding nobles can afford. It's 5:30 on a grey October morning in 1588, and you're already bent over your workbench in the dim light of 2 expensive beeswax candles, trying to attach seed pearls to the collar of a doublet that the Earl of Leicester needs for tomorrow's court appearance. Each pearl must be sewn individually with silk thread so fine it's nearly invisible, and a single misplaced stitch will ruin hours of work and cost you more money than a labourer sees in a month. Your workshop occupies the ground floor of a narrow house on Cheapside, in the heart of London's garment district. The space is cramped but strategically located, close enough to the Tower and Westminster to serve the court, but far enough from the royal palaces to afford the rent. The walls are lined with bolts of fabric in colours that have no names in common English: pompadour red, maiden's blush, seawater green, and dozens of others that exist only in the vocabulary of luxury. Hanging from wooden pegs are partially completed garments in various stages of construction. A farthingale here, a ruff there, sleeves waiting to be attached to bodices, trim waiting to be applied to hems. The smell of your trade permeates everything: yeast wax from the candles, linseed oil from treating leather, the musty sweetness of wool, the sharp metallic tang of gold and silver thread. But underneath it all is the smell of money, of ambition, of the desperate Elizabethan hunger for display that keeps tailors like you in business and drives your customers to bankruptcy. Your apprentice, young Tom Aldridge, arrives as the church bells chime 6 o'clock, his breath visible in the cold air. At 14, he's been with you for 2 years, long enough to handle simple tasks, but not long enough to be trusted with anything that could ruin you if he makes a mistake. He immediately begins preparing the fire in the small hearth that provides your only source of heat and light beyond candles. Expensive heat, since coal costs money and your profit margins are thinner than the silk you work with. Master Hartwell, Tom says, warming his hands over the growing flames, there's a gentleman outside wishes to speak with you. Says he's from Lord Burghley's household. Lord Burghley, William Cecil, the Queen's Secretary of State, one of the most powerful men in England. If his household is seeking your services, it could make your fortune or destroy you if you fail to meet their expectations. You wipe your hands on a cloth and step outside into the narrow street, where a well-dressed servant in Cecil livery waits with the patient resignation of a man accustomed to conducting his master's business at inconvenient hours. Master Hartwell, I am Thomas Weston, steward to his lordship. Lord Burghley requires a court dress for his ward, the Earl of Oxford, for the Christmas festivities at Greenwich. His lordship was specific about the requirements. He hands you a folded paper, sealed with Burghley's arms. You break the seal with trembling fingers and read instructions that make your stomach clench with equal parts excitement and terror. Oxford needs a complete ensemble doublet, hose, cloak, hat, and accessories suitable for dancing attendance on Her Majesty during the most important social season of the year. The materials specified include cloth of silver, white silk, ermine trim, and enough seed pearls to buy a small house. The deadline is 6 weeks away, which would be challenging enough if you were only working for one customer. But you're not working for one customer. You're working for half the court, because Christmas at Greenwich is the Elizabethan equivalent of Fashion Week, and every noble who expects to maintain their position needs new clothes that outshine their rivals while demonstrating their wealth, taste, and political sophistication. His lordship trusts that the usual terms will apply. Weston continues, payment upon completion, with a bonus for exceptional work and consequences for disappointment. You nod, though your mouth has gone dry. The usual terms in the luxury tailoring trade include provisions for financial ruin if you fail to deliver on time or to standard. Noble customers don't just sue for damages, they destroy reputations, block access to suppliers, and ensure that you never work for anyone of importance again. Success brings wealth and royal recognition. Failure brings professional extinction. After Weston leaves, you return to your workshop and spread Burgley's commission on your main table, next to the Leicester doublet and a half-finished gown for the Countess of Warwick. The paper seems to glow in the candlelight like a holy relic, promising either salvation or damnation depending on your skill in the coming weeks. Tom, you call. Send word to Master Harrison that I'll need 50 yards of his finest white silk, and to Master Pembroke that I require their best cloth of silver. Tell them it's for Lord Burgley, and that money is no object. This is only partly true. Money is always an object when you're a tradesman, even a successful one. The materials for Oxford's outfit will cost more than you typically spend in 3 months, and you'll have to pay your suppliers immediately while waiting weeks or months for payment from your noble customers. Cash flow is the constant nightmare of luxury trade. You're always floating enormous expenses on the promise of future payment from people who consider prompt payment beneath their dignity. Tom scurries off on his errands while you begin the most crucial phase of any major commissioned design process. Elizabethan court dress isn't just clothing, it's a complex visual language that communicates the wearer's political allegiances, family connections, personal wealth, and social ambitions. Every choice of colour, fabric, and decoration carries meaning that will be analysed and interpreted by every other person at court. Oxford is a complicated case. As Burgley's ward, he's connected to the most powerful political faction in England, but he's also known for his extravagant tastes and volatile temperament. His clothes need to demonstrate his loyalty to his guardian, while asserting his own importance as a peer of the realm. Too subdued, and he'll look like a poor relation. Too flashy, and he'll appear nouveau riche, or worse, disloyal to traditional English values. You pull out your sketchbook, luxury in itself, since paper is expensive, and begin drawing rough designs. The doublet should follow the current fashion for a long fitted torso with a slight peascod belly, but the proportions need to flatter Oxford's particular build. The hose should be properly stuffed and shaped to create the masculine silhouette that Elizabeth's court demands. The cloak needs enough dramatic flair to make an impression when he enters a room, but not so much that it overshadows other nobles, or, God forbid, the Queen herself. By noon, your workshop has become a hive of activity. Tom has returned with word that your suppliers can provide the materials, though at prices that make you wince. Your journeyman, Robert Fletcher, has arrived to help with the basic construction work, and your wife, Margaret, has come down from the family quarters above the shop to handle the business side of the operation, keeping track of expenses, managing the household accounts, and making sure you don't promise more than you can deliver. Margaret is the daughter of a successful mercer, raised in the cloth trade, and she understands the economics of luxury better than most men in the business. She takes one look at Burgley's commission and immediately begins calculating costs. The materials alone will run to £40, she says, which is more than a skilled craftsman earns in 2 years. If we can deliver on time and to standard, Burgley will pay £60. That's £20 profit, assuming nothing goes wrong. And if something does go wrong, we lose the material costs, our reputation, and probably our house, since we'll have to borrow against it to pay the suppliers. This is the reality of working for Elizabethan nobles, enormous potential rewards balanced against equally enormous risks. Success in the luxury trades can lift a craftsman into the merchant class, and even, occasionally, into minor nobility. Failure can destroy not just your business, but your entire family's future. The first challenge is acquiring the materials. Cloth of silver doesn't just sit on shelves waiting for customers. It has to be specially woven, often to order, using silver wire so fine and delicate that much of it breaks during the weaving process. The best cloth of silver comes from Italy or Flanders, which means either travelling to buy it personally or trusting merchants whose ships might be delayed by weather, pirates, or international politics. You spend the afternoon negotiating with Master Harrison, whose shop specialises in the finest imported silks. He's a round, prosperous man who's dressed better than most nobles, because his business gives him access to materials that even earls can't always afford. Cloth of silver for Lord Burgley's ward, he muses, stroking his beard. I have some excellent pieces from Venice, but they're committed to other customers. There's a shipment expected from Antwerp next week. But with the Spanish situation, he shrugs eloquently. The Spanish situation is Philip II's ongoing war against England, which has made trade with the Low Countries dangerous and unpredictable. Spanish privateers regularly capture English merchant ships, and even those that get through often arrive months behind schedule. What would it take to redirect some of the Venice cloth? You ask, though you already know the answer will be expensive. The other customers would need to be compensated for the delay, and I'd need a guarantee of payment regardless of when Burgley settles his account. 2 hours of negotiation later, you've agreed to pay 50% above the normal price for cloth of silver that may or may not arrive in time for your deadline. You've also committed to personally guaranteeing payment, which means your house and workshop are now collateral for a noble's wardrobe. Back in your shop, you begin the detailed planning that will determine whether this commission makes or ruins you. Every garment needs to be broken down into individual components, each measured and cut precisely, with allowances for fitting adjustments and potential mistakes. The doublet alone requires dozens of pieces: front panels, back panels, sleeves, collar, trim pieces, and internal structures that will give it the proper shape. Tom and Robert begin preparing the workspace, clearing tables and setting up the large cutting boards you'll need for laying out fabric. Margaret starts a fire under the iron pot, where you'll heat your pressing tools, flat irons that must be kept at exactly the right temperature to smooth seams without scorching delicate fabrics. Master, Tom says, looking up from his work, what about the pearls? Will they come from Master Pembroke as well? The pearls. You'd almost forgotten about the hundreds of seed pearls specified in Burgley's instructions. Each one needs to be individually selected for size and luster, then sewn onto the garment with silk thread in patterns that will catch and reflect candlelight during evening festivities. It's tedious work that strains the eyes and requires steady hands, and a single loose pearl during a court function could be interpreted as shoddy workmanship. Send word to Master Davies, the jeweller, you tell Tom. Tell him I need the finest seed pearls he can provide, all matched for size and colour. And tell him, you pause, calculating expenses that keep mounting like storm clouds. Tell him Lord Burgley expects perfection. The next week passes in a blur of cutting, pinning, basting, and fitting. Oxford himself comes for measurements, arriving in a litter with 6 servants and an attitude that makes clear he considers this entire process beneath his dignity. He's a thin, pale young man with the nervous energy of someone who's spent his entire life being told he's important without ever being given anything meaningful to do. "Master Hartwell," he says, barely acknowledging your bow. "Lord Burghley says you're the finest tailor in London. I trust his judgment, but I warn you, I have very specific requirements." The fitting process is an exercise in diplomacy as much as craftsmanship. You need to take precise measurements while managing Oxford's ego, making suggestions about style and fit without appearing to criticize his taste, and ensuring that the finished garments will flatter his figure without making it obvious that you're compensating for his physical shortcomings. "The doublet should emphasize the chest," Oxford instructs, "and the hose must be properly proportioned. I've seen too many gentlemen who look like scarecrows because their tailors don't understand masculine elegance." You nod and make careful notes, though privately you're thinking that Oxford's own figure presents some challenges. He's shorter than fashionable, with narrow shoulders and a tendency toward a rounded back that comes from too much reading and not enough physical activity. The clothes will need to create the illusion of height and breadth, while maintaining the natural grace that Elizabeth's court demands. The measurements complete, you begin the actual construction process. This is where your years of training and experience become crucial, because working with cloth of silver requires techniques that few tailors have mastered. The metal threads are fragile and prone to tarnishing. The fabric can't be pressed with too much heat, and every cut must be perfect because mistakes can't be hidden or easily corrected. You start with the doublet body, cutting the front and back panels from a single piece of cloth of silver to ensure perfect colour matching. The fabric whispers like silk, but catches the light like captured starlight, and even in the dim illumination of your workshop, it seems to glow with its own inner fire. This is material fit for angels or queens, and you're acutely aware that you're handling more wealth than most people see in their lifetimes. The construction techniques for luxury garments are fundamentally different from ordinary tailoring. Every seam must be reinforced with silk thread. Every edge must be finished to prevent fraying, and every structural element must be built to withstand the stresses of court life, dancing, kneeling, sudden movements required by royal protocol. The doublet needs internal stays to maintain its shape, padding to create the fashionable silhouette, and dozens of tiny buttons that must be sewn on individually and covered with matching fabric. Robert handles the preliminary work, mites basting seams, preparing trim pieces, sewing on basic structural elements. But the detailed work falls to you, because Oxford will inspect every stitch, and any imperfection will reflect on your reputation. You work by candlelight, well into the night, your eyes burning from the strain of threading needles, with silk so fine it's barely visible. The pearl work alone takes a full week. Each seed pearl must be sewn onto the collar and cuffs in patterns that follow the natural lines of the garment, while creating visual interest under candlelight. You develop a rhythm, pierce the fabric with your needle, slide the pearl onto the thread, pass the needle back through the fabric, pull tight enough to secure the pearl without puckering the cloth, move to the next position. Hundreds of times, thousands of times, until your fingers are raw and your back aches from hunching over the work. Margaret brings you meals at your workbench, because you can't afford to lose the time it would take to eat properly. Tom fetches supplies and runs errands while you work, and Robert handles the secondary garments, the hose, the cloak, the accessories that complete the ensemble. The workshop becomes a small factory dedicated to the single purpose of making one young man look magnificent for a few weeks of court festivities. But you're not just competing against other tailors, you're competing against the entire European fashion industry. Nobles at Elizabeth's court wear clothes imported from Italy, France, Spain, and the Low Countries, garments made by craftsmen who've had generations to perfect their techniques. An English tailor needs to match the quality of the best continental work while working with inferior materials and less developed supply chains. The pressure intensifies as your deadline approaches. Word spreads through London's fashion community that you're working on a major commission for Burghley, and suddenly every supplier, competitor, and potential customer is watching to see whether you can deliver. Success will establish you as one of London's premier tailors. Failure will mark you as someone who promises more than he can achieve. 3 weeks into the project, disaster strikes. A shipment of silver thread from Venice arrives water damaged, the precious metal tarnished, and the silk backing rotted from exposure to seawater. It's the thread you need to complete the decorative work on Oxford's cloak, and there's no time to order replacement materials from Italy. We could try to clean it, Robert suggests, examining the damaged thread with the desperate optimism of someone who knows his job depends on finding a solution. Look at it, you reply, holding a strand up to the candlelight. It's black as coal. Even if we could remove the tarnish, the silk is ruined. Margaret joins the conference, bringing her merchant's eye to the problem. What about London sources? Master Goldsmith might have silver wire we could spin into thread. The quality won't match, you point out. Oxford will notice the difference immediately, and if Burghley's household thinks we're trying to pass off inferior materials, then we're ruined either way, Margaret finishes. Better to take the risk than guarantee failure. You spend the next 2 days locating silver wire and finding someone skilled enough to spin it into thread, fine enough for decorative work. The process is expensive. You end up paying 3 times what the Venetian thread would have cost. And the results are visibly different from your original materials, but it's the best you can do under the circumstances, and you pray that candlelight will obscure the imperfections. The final week is a race against time and exhaustion. You work 18 hours a day, stopping only when your eyes can no longer focus on your needlework. Tom and Robert take shifts, maintaining the fire, preparing meals, and handling the basic tasks that keep the workshop functioning. Margaret manages the business side, dealing with suppliers who want immediate payment and customers who want to know why their own commissions are being delayed. The finishing work requires skills that few tailors possess. Buttonholes must be cut and reinforced by hand using techniques that create both strength and beauty. Trim must be applied in patterns that enhance the garment's lines while demonstrating the tailor's artistry. Every loose thread must be trimmed, every seam must be pressed, every detail must be perfect enough to withstand close inspection by people whose entire lives revolve around detecting and criticizing imperfections in others. 2 days before the deadline, Oxford arrives for his final fitting. He's accompanied by Lord Burghley himself, a grey-haired man with sharp eyes who examines your work with the intensity of someone evaluating a military strategy. You help Oxford into the completed outfit, adjusting the fit and checking every detail while trying to ignore the fact that your entire future depends on the next few minutes. The transformation is remarkable. Oxford, who looked like a nervous young scholar when he entered your shop, now appears every inch the court nobleman. The cloth of silver doublet catches and reflects light from every angle. The pearls create subtle patterns that draw attention to his face, and the overall silhouette gives him the presence and authority that his birth entitles him to, but his natural bearing lacks. "Excellent work, Master Hartwell," Burghley says after a long inspection. His lordship looks precisely as he should for court appearances. Oxford himself seems pleased, though he examines every detail with the critical eye of someone who understands that his reputation depends as much on his appearance as his lineage. He tests the movement of the doublet, checks the fall of the cloak, adjusts the set of his hat until everything meets his exacting standards. The workmanship is satisfactory, he declares, which from a nobleman is equivalent to enthusiastic praise. Lord Burghley's confidence was well placed. Payment, when it comes, arrives in the form of silver coins that Tom can barely lift, £60 in actual silver, more money than you've ever seen at one time. But even as you count the coins, you're already calculating the costs of your next commission, because success in the luxury trades means constantly raising your standards and taking on increasingly ambitious projects. The Christmas season brings vindication of your work. Oxford appears at court in your creation and receives the kind of attention that makes or destroys reputations in Elizabethan society. Word spreads through the noble households that Master Hartwell is a tailor capable of dressing peers in a manner befitting their rank, and suddenly your workshop is flooded with commissions from customers who previously patronized more established competitors. But success brings its own challenges. Each new customer expects work that surpasses what you've done before, using materials that are more expensive and techniques that are more demanding. The Earl of Essex wants a suit that outshines Oxford's. The Countess of Pembroke needs a gown that demonstrates her family's wealth without appearing ostentatious. Every commission becomes a test of your ability to balance artistry, craftsmanship, and diplomacy while managing the complex logistics of luxury production. Your workshop expands to meet demand. You take on additional apprentices, hire more journeymen, and rent additional space for storing the growing inventory of fabrics and materials required for noble commissions. Margaret handles the increasingly complex business operations, negotiating with suppliers, managing cash flow, and maintaining the client relationships that determine your continued success. But the fundamental nature of your work remains unchanged. You're still spending your days bent over a workbench, threading needles with silk so fine it's barely visible, attaching ornaments so valuable that a single mistake could cost more than most people earn in a year. Your fingers still bleed from handling the finest materials. Your eyes still burn from working by candlelight, and your back still aches from hunching over detailed work that requires absolute precision. The irony isn't lost on you that you're getting rich by helping other people display their wealth, creating garments so expensive and elaborate that they can only be worn a few times before fashion changes, demand something completely different. You're participating in a system of conspicuous consumption that seems designed to transfer money from the theoretically wealthy nobility to the actually prosperous merchant class. But you're also practicing a craft that represents the highest achievements of human artistic and technical skill. The garments you create aren't just clothing, they're wearable art that combines aesthetic beauty with technical excellence and cultural significance. When Oxford walks into the Queen's presence wearing your doublet, he's not just demonstrating his wealth and status, he's participating in a visual language that defines what it means to be English, noble, and worthy of royal attention. As you work late into another night, adding the final touches to a gown for the New Year's festivities, you reflect on the strange position you occupy in Elizabethan society. You're a tradesman who works with your hands, but you create objects that shape how the most powerful people in England present themselves to the world. You're dependent on noble patronage, but your skills give you a form of independence that few craftsmen enjoy. The candle burns low as you finish the last seam, and in its flickering light, the silk seems to come alive with possibilities. Tomorrow some great lady will wear this gown to court, where it will be seen and admired and perhaps copied by other nobles seeking to match her style. Your work will become part of the visual pageantry that makes Elizabeth's court the most magnificent in Europe, contributing to the image of English power and sophistication that influences politics and trade across the continent. You snuff the candle and lock up your workshop, knowing that tomorrow will bring new challenges, new commissions, new opportunities to transform expensive materials into dreams made manifest in silk and silver. The life of a court tailor is demanding, dangerous, and exhausting, but it's also a chance to practice your craft at the highest level while helping to create the visual language of power that defines your age. In your dreams, you see endless bolts of silk in colours that have no names, needles that thread themselves, and seams that sew themselves perfectly straight. But you wake to the reality of bleeding fingers, aching eyes, and the constant pressure to exceed your previous achievements, while managing the complex demands of customers who consider perfection a reasonable expectation rather than an extraordinary achievement. Such is the life of a master tailor in the age of Elizabeth artist, craftsman, businessman, servant to the magnificent vanity that drives the most powerful people in the world to spend fortunes on clothes they'll wear only a handful of times before fashion demands something entirely new.